Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 9 of Death Space Filling the Void. I can't believe we're already at episode 9. I'm Patrick Jones, talking to you from Charleston, South Carolina. What a weekend. I hope everyone had a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. Jamie and I went to Kiowa Beach to see some friends who were staying down there, and then out to a lake in western South Carolina, and wow, just laying in a raft on a lake and seeing friends. Oh my goodness, it's like exactly what you've been dreaming about this whole pandemic. I've been thinking a lot about last week's episode and the notion that sitting with someone who's grieving is so much better than trying to fix it with words. But if you can't sit with them, just saying, I'm sorry that you're in pain and I'm sorry you're going through this. Making your presence felt is so important, but not trying to do too much. It's tough to know what to say, but the answer seems to be somewhere along the lines of just making your presence felt. I have a pretty different episode today. I look at this podcast as trying to tell a diverse, collective story about death and grief, and trying to approach it from a journalistic mindset. And so when I was recording season 1 and season 2, I reached out to a bunch of religious groups to see if I can get anyone to talk to me about their faith and how their faith looks at death. Of course, no one person can speak for an entire faith, unless maybe you're the Pope. But even the Pope doesn't talk for every single Catholic and how they individually experience death and grief and how they view the afterlife. I reached out to a bunch of Native American groups, several Christian churches. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to connect with anyone from those faiths who were willing to speak with me while being recorded. But I'm going to keep trying for season 3. But I was connected with a Buddhist monk who goes by Tenzin Namdak. Nomdak is a monk with a Western scientific education who teaches Buddhist mind science, philosophy, and practice worldwide based on 2 decades of study from a monastic university in South India. And we had a great conversation. This interview was conducted in, I want to say, early September of 2020. Jamie and I were actually on a bit of a socially distant road trip, and we were in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the time. Love Minnesota. Nomdak and I had a wonderful conversation about how the faith of Buddhism approaches death, how they view death, how they view life. To be honest, I haven't really engaged with too much about Buddhism or really know anyone who is Buddhist. So it's a lot of fun hearing a different perspective, and I think you're really going to enjoy it as well. So let's jump in. Namdak, I'm very excited to speak with you today and get some insight on how Buddhists look at death and how they teach it.
I'm very happy to be part of your project, so to say.
Yeah, so I have definitely been looking forward to this. So I want to start a little bit by finding out a little bit about you and your story.
Yeah, so me and my story can be very long, can be very short. I was a university student in the Netherlands, and I started to develop some interest in philosophy, especially Eastern philosophy. I was 18 or 19, something like that. So then in my early 20s, I met Buddhism in the center Netherlands. And I was finishing my university degree in hydrology, which is quite scientific, actually.
Yeah.
But being interested in other aspects of philosophy and then attending a few courses or a few weekends, so to say, then my mind changed quite quickly, so to say. I find within Buddhism, there's always the possibility to question things, right? You can always ask a question and check things out, which is very scientific.
Yeah.
So that attracted me quite a lot. And as a youngster, you have always questions about the meaning of life. Is there past and future lifetimes? Is there more possible? Why some people suffering more than others? So it's not that I straight away saw the answers, but I saw possibilities to come to answering those questions, so to say. And that attracted me more, that I did one research for the government, which I was committed to. And after finishing that research, then I went to India, basically, straight away. and already with the idea to become monastic, to become a monk.
Okay.
And based on that idea, I started with learning Tibetan language, because we study Buddhism within a Tibetan tradition, with this kind of ancient Indian Nalanda tradition, one of the big monastic universities of India. So it's based on that kind of tradition. So I started learning Tibetan, and then soon after that decided to become a monk and took ordinations from His Holiness Dalai Lama. And then soon after that moved to South India, where there are big monastic universities, and to study in depth Buddhist philosophy, psychology, epistemology.
How hard is
Yeah,
it to wind up where you wound up? Is it accepting to all individuals? Is it something you have to study?
It's open to everybody, right? I
Yeah.
mean, if people are interested, Buddhism by itself, as His Holiness often describes it, you can study it on different levels, right? You can study Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist psychology on a very secular or universal level without really engaging in Buddhist practices as such, right? You can just study, and that's the freedom, right? We don't emphasize kind of converting people to a particular religion, because the world has many human beings. Many human beings have different inclinations and interests. So there's different religions as well, and different forms of faith, right? So we respect that, because there's different. So that's why we respect any other form of faith or religion, because Buddhism is not the perfect kind of fit for everybody, right? So yeah, so that's one thing. And then even within Buddhism, people would like to study it more, practice it more. There's many levels of dedication, right? Some people have normal jobs and study it on the side, and other people dedicate their life. Yeah, so that's kind of different possibilities, so to say. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. And you said you studied under the Dalai Lama himself?
I mean, I received many teachings from His Holiness, but also in the monastic environment, we have daily classes, and of course, His Holiness Dalai Lama doesn't have time to teach all the thousands of monks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. You were saying you studied Buddhism, and how long were you in India studying?
Altogether, I spent about a little bit over 2 decades.
Okay.
Yeah. So it is quite a long period. Yeah.
Yeah. And were you like, that's a lot of time to dedicate it. That's fully immersing yourself. Were you a religious kid? Were you brought up with religion in your family, or just like a genuine curiosity led you to find Buddhism?
Yeah, more curiosity, I think, because my parents were not really religious.
Okay.
You know, of course, we come from a Christian background. I think I was the person who went more to church than my parents, actually.
Okay.
Just to see things and to examine things, and then you start reading, and the ball starts rolling, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, so you were talking about how Buddhism has a bit of a scientific background. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how that is, or how that comes into play?
Yeah, because I mean, it's summarized in one particular quote by the Buddha himself, where it says, you venerable monks and scholars, you shouldn't accept whatever I say out of respect or reverence for me. You should examine my teachings like you examine gold, right? So in the early days, if you buy something precious, you examine and make sure you get the right quality, right?
Yeah.
So in modern times, we have an iPhone or a mobile phone or laptop whatsoever, we examine before we buy, right? So in a similar way, the Buddha was quite direct. And also His Holiness Dalai Lama even goes to the extent that if science proves something different than in a particular classical text, and that's been proven, we can accept science. So that's a very open approach. Yeah.
I love that. That sounds wonderful. And that, right? Exactly. That's how science, if theories are theories until they're fact, and that can shift at all times. And
so that also, just to make sure, that's so also that Buddhism is not kind of a religion as such, right? It's kind of the science of the mind and its philosophy. That's basically what the real hardcore aspect of Buddhism is actually all about.
Interesting.
And then you examine and you try to put it into practice, and then based on the understanding that all sentient beings want happiness and don't want suffering, then we examine what are the causes for suffering, what are the causes for happiness, how can I abandon causes for suffering and acquire causes for happiness. So that's basically the principal aspect here.
So when you're studying Buddhism, is it trying to maybe rewire your thinking more towards what you're describing, in that all beings want happiness and to avoid
Mhm.
suffering. How do you approach that?
Is one aspect is what we try to study texts of masters of the past who have actually realized these aspects, not just mere academic knowledge, but have contemplated it and came to the real understanding of it, right? Made the innate part of themselves. So based on those kind of texts, we read it and we check if it's true or not, according to these principles of the open approach of analytical questioning. So then you check your own mind and you see that we all want happiness and that we can prove that as soon as we have a little bit of happiness, we want to keep it, right?
Yeah.
As soon as we have a little bit of suffering, with just a simple sickness or mental difficulty, the first thought that comes to mind is we want to be separated from this.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So that's a very innate wish. And then the next step is, what is the cause for suffering? Right? And then we start to analyze that a lot of our destructive emotions, so to say, right? Negative thoughts, anger, right? And those kind of things that disturb our minds, they are causing us disturbance. And that reflects or reacts in the physical and verbal behavior, which we also can possibly harm others based on destructive emotions. Right?
Absolutely.
So that's why it's called, really talks about mind science. And can we, so to say, eliminate these destructive emotions, and on which levels, and how do we do that? And how do we enhance more constructive way of thinking and more positive kind of emotions to be developed, right? So that's kind of a very principal, basic aspect we study. Mm-hmm. And then we do self-research. We examine a contemplation and reflect upon it if it's really true, and then just a daily experience. And then you come to a conclusion if it's true or not. Yeah.
The most interesting aspect of what you were just saying is that you may read a text and think of it differently than I may interpret that. Is there a lot of, you think of this one way, I think of it another way, and that's okay? Or is
that's okay.
That's okay.
It's perfectly okay, because in the monastic tradition, we have a kind of gathering with the scholars together. It's called philosophical debate. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of a huge debate courtyard where students meet. Fun. Yeah, it's really fun, I tell you. You should watch some YouTube videos of people clapping their hands. It's very it's a lot of fun. But what happens there is very interesting, is that we study a text ourselves, and my other classmate might study a complete different text with different interpretations. Then we go to different teachers who have different kind of understandings and interpretations, and that all mixes together on this kind of debate courtyard. Yeah. So then we have a scriptural reference, but we also have logic, right? So in between those two, we move back and forth, and we come to a new finding or new conclusion, a new understanding. It's a kind of a very energetic way of using logic together with insights.
I love how active that is, right?
It's extremely active. Yeah.
As opposed to being spoken to, right? I was raised Catholic, and it's more, here's what the priest has to say today, and I love the active footing. Not to put down Catholics at all, I'm Catholic, but I do like how active that is. Yeah. Prior to this, you were on, how would you describe it? A bit of a retreat where you were practicing silence?
It's not only silence, we Buddhist practice, so to say, we have different types of meditation, right? We have a kind of concentration meditation, because without the mind being concentrated, it's very difficult to do any mind training, constructive way of thinking, right? So we need a certain amount of concentration. Even just to read a book, you need concentration, right?
Right.
So we practice a kind of concentration meditation, or we call placement meditation, right? And then the other aspect of meditation is what we call analytical, because our mind uses reasoning. The same is true when, for example, when a destructive emotion takes over, like anger. Within a few split seconds, you make yourself convinced that this person or this situation is really bad and you don't like it, right? Because of this, because of this, because of that, right?
So puffing, yeah.
So that goes very fast, but most of those reasons are not very valid. That's the problem. And that's why we classify them as destructive emotions, right? Because they cause problems. So, but you have
anger can completely distract you from. It's kind of blinding in a sense.
Exactly, blinding. Exactly, because you lose the clarity of the mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because losing that clarity of the mind, you see only one aspect of reality, and that's the negative aspects. You don't like to see the good things of reality, right?
Yeah.
So the mind is not in accordance with reality at all. Yeah, and that's why it causes a problem. So that analytical approach, we have the possibility to counteract and transform a kind of destructive emotion like that and transform it into more constructive emotion like love and kindness and compassion, for example.
That sounds beautiful. It
Yeah.
sounds like
It sounds
needs
beautiful and it sounds very interesting, but it's not easy, of course, right? To change the mind is not easy, but it's possible, yeah, over time.
Yeah. And well, and human beings are inherently flawed, right? And so it is certainly difficult to overcome our flaws at times.
Yeah.
You know, this all leads us to the conversation of death. I'm interested to hear how Buddhism looks at death, its teachings. Where do you go when you die? Where you don't go?
Yeah. So first of all, that is being taken as an aspect of life. Yeah. So that means it is contemplated. It's not being pushed in a corner or something like that. So now in modern times in the West, we see similar, luckily, developments that in the early days you don't talk about these issues, right? I think about maybe 50 years ago you won't have this kind of conversation at all.
Right.
Yeah. So luckily now there's more acceptance because we're gonna face it ourselves. Right?
Yes, all of us.
Yeah. So that being the case, we might as well examine it. Right. So, and not only examine it, also accept it. You know, that's a very important step because people who don't accept these aspects of life, when they meet that reality, then it's a problem, right? Because it's very difficult to deal with. Yeah. I always use an example of my own mother, for example, that her son is, walking around as a Buddhist monk, and she saw I'm really getting something out of it, so that's why she started reading about Buddhism, about that impermanence. Yeah, and she doesn't call herself a Buddhist, right? But then when my father got cancer, it went very quick, and within a few months, actually, he passed away.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, so then my aunts and uncles thought my mother goes in depression for months because they were always close, and it's sad, right? It's a kind of a loss. Yeah.
Of course.
So, though of course there was sadness, but she could deal with it quite well, and the doctor was very impressed, and the people in the family were very impressed. And I asked my mother later on, "How did you do it?" And then she said, "I was reading about this and thinking it's possible one day." You see, so that acceptance prevents a lot of suffering. So if you understand reality, it prevents a lot of suffering.
When you say
so that's one aspect. Yeah.
Sorry. When you say acceptance, it's that like we're only here for X amount of time. We have no determination of when that time is for the most part, and we should just enjoy it and accept the fact that that's it and that's all we get.
There's one aspect. Yeah, there's one aspect. So that because if you always put it in a corner, and when it happens to you, it's a kind of a shock, right?
Yes.
You're not prepared, so to say. That's one aspect. Another aspect is there's a very famous quote of Shantideva who always says, if there's a problem and you can solve the problem, then you shouldn't worry too much. You should solve it. If you have a problem, right? If you have a problem but you cannot solve it, right? We cannot avoid that. Then also there's no point in worrying about it. Right? So old age, for example, we're getting older and things become more and more difficult, right? So we cannot change that reality, So there's no point in worrying about it, and we just have to accept it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And the same with COVID-19, all kind of difficulties we face in life. If we can do anything about it, we should, and we should, we should try to support those organizations who do something about it. But if that's not within our hands, then we should accept it, right? There's basically no. If you worry about it, then on top of the physical difficulty, there's mental suffering as well. You see?
Right. There's only small things we can do, like wearing a mask and trying to stay
of course.
separate.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's up to doctors and scientists to come up with a vaccine. Yeah.
But the same with death, right? It's going to happen to us. So, in that way, we prepare. We have a kind of an acceptance, so to say. Yeah.
How do you prepare?
There's many ways to prepare, but the most basic one is to understand that's going to happen to you or to family members or to friends, right? And if you understand that, then acceptance becomes easier and it doesn't disturb you as much as if you'd always try to put it in a corner, and then when you meet it, it's a bit difficult to deal with, right?
Do you feel, did that sort of acceptance take some time for you, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's many things to say about the death process and what happens after also, right?
Yeah.
So even in the scientific findings, if you look, for example, at statistics of near-death experience, right? People who have an experience in the clinical death, when mostly in cardiac arrests, when the heart stops beating, and the person is clinically dead for a certain period of time and comes back to life, is revived, right?
Yes.
So people who have that experience, in the statistics, it shows that whoever had that experience, the majority, like 70% or something, has their life changed completely in a positive way. So that means they become more spiritual, become more compassionate, they find more satisfaction in life.
Right.
And that's a very
the
interesting
air
sign.
smells a bit sweeter, right? Like the
Yeah,
sun's shining a bit brighter.
So, yeah. And people with near-death visions, there's a lot of scientific data showing that it's not that something to fear or to worry about, basically. One aspect. And then the other aspect you asking partly in your question, is there something after death, right? So that's, for Buddhists, also a kind of important point.
Yeah.
So if you study the near-death experience, then we don't go further if the person comes back to life, right? The person can talk about what has been experienced, but if it doesn't come back to life, it goes somewhere else, maybe, right? So that's the question. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, in that context, then certain forms of faith or religion, they talk about, either go to heaven or go to another rebirth. There's many kind of ways of you can find kind of explanations, right, in different fields of philosophy or forms of faith or religion. Yeah. So Buddhists also, they have their own interpretation. That means this is not only life. Yeah. So there's a continuity of consciousness, as we call it, that can take rebirth. And then that's the present human body we have is just like a temporary guest house, so to say. Yes.
And we're reborn again and again?
Again and again. And then, because we just talked about in the beginning of our discussion that there's a possibility for the mind to change, right? If we analyze destructive emotions, we analyze constructive emotions, we apply certain kind of techniques to enhance positive ways of thinking and constructive forms of consciousness, there's possibility to improve, right? Your level of consciousness. And that also, with that comes also to experience more kind of genuine form or happiness that gives more satisfaction in life.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So, because we know that external factors of the physical world is not going to produce ultimate satisfaction, right? So next to the development we have in the external world, we also have to spend some time and effort in internal development. Yeah. So His Holiness Dalai Lama says many times, my religion, my faith, my organization, my country, my this, my that, that's past tense. We have to have something that is universal, right? Because our mind, from all the 7 billion people on this planet, our consciousness is universal, right? We all have the same wish for happiness, don't like suffering. We have the same emotions. So there's a way of learning that, understanding that, depending on science, one hand, right? And on the other hand, like ancient forms of philosophy and psychology can bring a lot of kind of interesting points. Yeah? So if we bring that together, then there's a possibility of an inner development next to the external development we have in our physical world, right?
Yeah.
So that inner development is not easy, as we just discussed, right? It will take time.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
And we don't think, as Buddhists, we don't think about a few years. We think about decades, or some even think about lifetimes, right? So when His Holiness met with scientists, there's kind of a Mind and Life Institute, is kind of an organization being put up to build a bridge between science and Buddhist mind science and philosophy, so to say. And then one of the scientists asked His Holiness, how long are you studying these matters? And then His Holiness said, for the last 14 lifetimes. So it gives a little bit idea that, this vast vision of, we keep developing over time.
Right. Do you know how people always say the right thing in a TV show like a This Is Us or Grey's Anatomy? It's surprising that that's still in the air, but I'm sure, Meredith Grey is saying the right things. It's because someone's writing the words for them. And you can have that power too with the cardist. A card delivers joy and connection, but it's hard to muster that positive energy in this pandemic. There were parts of this pandemic where even watching The Office wasn't helpful enough because I was so sad. Introducing a writing specialist for the message inside your greeting card. See, that's what I'm talking about with the TV shows. They're writing it for you. The Cardist Studio creates your message, writes it in the card, and mails it for you. All you do is pick the card and tell why you're sending it. No errands, no emotional exercise. For a message from your heart, but not your hands. We want to be as open and in touch with our emotions as you see on TV. Sit back and just enjoy your relationships. TheCardistStudio.com, thoughtful, just got easy. And you can use the promo code DEATHPOD for 10% off all orders. Today's episode is also brought to you by My Software Tutor. Do you fear the spreadsheet? Jamie always laughs at me because my spreadsheets are bare bones, straight to the point. They have exactly what they need and no frills. And hers are like color-coded and bolded and just like remarkable looking. I guess in like spreadsheet land, I'm a bit of a no frills kind of guy. But I'm trying to work on that. And so, phobia be gone. My Software Tutor offers 3 levels of real-time Zoom-based courses with a live instructor. They all deliver practical, functional business skills in a friendly, supportive environment. I'd love to ask the question, how do I make my spreadsheets just look all dolled up? How do I put a sport coat on this spreadsheet? These courses will increase your marketability, whether you're an employee, job seeker, consultant, or contractor. Register at mysoftwaretutor.com and use the promo code POD20 to save 20% off all registrations. Yeah, all right, let's get back to Nomdak. One thing that sticks out is just there seems to be so much patience involved in studying Buddhism, and I kind of love that in just like slowing everything down, especially in this world now where we're constantly connected and can feel overwhelmed. It seems like a nice thing to just say, I'm just going to work internally and trying to improve myself, because if I do that, I'm bringing a better version into the world. Yeah. The other question that I have is, you're mentioning, the Dalai Lama talking about how he's been studying for the past 40 lifetimes. Is there the notion that you carry something with you from lifetime to lifetime?
Yeah, we say that consciousness is not physical, right? So there's a lot of research being done in the fields of neurophenomenology and neuroscience, that there is something that we call consciousness, which is maybe not matter. It's still a big question, right, in neuroscience.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, but there's some research being done about the correlation between the two. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the correlation is being proven, but what consciousness is all about is quite new, right, in modern science. Yeah. So the stream of consciousness, basically, as we also see in near-death experience, and there's other events. For example, Professor Stevenson did some research about children remembering previous lifetimes, and talks about, information being carried. That's a very interesting comment, actually. Information being carried from a previous personality to the present, right? So that's what we call, as Buddhists, we call the stream of consciousness. Yeah. So in that stream of consciousness, all kind of habituation patterns, they will continue. So the more you develop positive aspects of mind, that will be continued, right? And then next lifetime you continue more and more. And so there's a kind of spiritual progress is possible to develop the mind more and more and become more compassionate and practice more patience and get more of those constructive forms of consciousness. Yeah.
Interesting. So it's more, it's less, obviously from lifetime to lifetime, you have to relearn that, a stove is hot, whereas you can learn to be kinder and calmer and more at peace.
Yeah. But even in one lifetime, right, if you study a particular subject and you put the books away, you forget, right? Yes. But then if you take the books again, it comes back quicker.
It does.
Right? So that's a sign there are,
I see what you're saying.
yeah, there's a sign there are inclinations or imprints, as we call it, or potentials in the mind that is not wasted, right? So that's planted before. It's just a matter of fact of activating that again. And then it comes back easier, right? So that proves the power of habituation of consciousness, right?
Right. It's stored away in there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we don't say store away somewhere because memory in neuroscience is a very difficult subject, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, there are things consciousness needs a brain to function, but the brain is not the only thing, right? That's what we now try to find out, actually. What is consciousness?
That's a great question.
Yeah, yeah. So when the Buddha was not really interested much in the physical aspects of our body, he was more interested in consciousness. Yeah, and also in those times, like 2,500 years ago, we didn't have phenomena like neuroscience, right? The science of the brain was not present.
Right.
So only the internal contemplation was present, right? So you could examine what consciousness is all about. What are constructive emotions? What are destructive ones? You can classify them, put there a definition or a function to it, and then you can work with it, right? So there's a kind of different approach. So when I was studying these aspects of epistemology and philosophy, having a background in science, mathematics, and statistics, then it's very interesting. Very interesting. It's a completely different methodology. Yeah. Because the methodology we use in Buddhist philosophy, psychology, using the language of epistemology or reasoning, right? Well, in science, we use the language of mathematics. Yeah, it's two total different forms of approach. But if you can now come to the ultimate nature of reality, so to say, right? If you study quantum mechanics and then you take people like David Bohm, for example, or other scholars in quantum mechanics who come to similar conclusions as the Buddha and many philosophers of 2,000 years ago came to similar conclusions, that nothing exists from its own side. Everything is in the nature of interdependence. So in quantum mechanics, we come to similar conclusions, right? What has been observed depends on the observer, right?
Yeah.
So that's just two different types of methodology, but it doesn't say you should reach different conclusions, right?
That's a great point. Yeah. What would you say to someone who's grieving or someone, someone who hasn't quite accepted, may not have even thought about death and is now experiencing a lot of grief? Yeah.
So first of all, of course, a person who is in that situation needs a person to listen to this person, right? That's the first, to show you take care of the person, right? To show that you accept what's happening. That's a very important step, right? Because the person who is in this grieving process is based on losing a particular person. Yeah, we always want to be the person that falls away. So there's a need for helping out, right? So there's a need for showing affection for that person, showing interest to help. Yeah, that's the first step.
Yeah, right. Being seen by another person is very important.
Yeah, sit along with that person, talk about things. That's the first step. Then people open up, right? And then, of course, according to their understanding, we have to discuss of different ways you can think about these issues. And what we started with in our discussion is mainly this acceptance, right?
Yeah.
That it's going to happen to all of us. So that's the first step. Yeah. And the other step is keeping grieving about it. You know, of course, sadness is there, but to think about it again and again is not going to solve the issue, right? The person we lost is not coming back, and you yourself will not experience more kind of constructive way of thinking, right? So that grieving by itself, we also have to analyze. It's a natural process, but also we have to think about it, if it's very beneficial to keep following it that way, or maybe we should need a break, get out of, move kind of in a different pattern of our daily activities that breaks the cycle, right? Okay. And then, that's very important to listen to the person, to make sure you take the person out for a walk, talk about things. You break that cycle of thinking about it again and again, because thinking about it again and again is not really very constructive, to be honest.
No, it's
right?
not.
Yeah, so that has to be broken. And then what I said with my mother is an incredible example. Then I said, but then how do you deal with it? She said, life has to go on, right?
Yes,
so
it does.
That's a very interesting comment. And she became more social. She did more hobby kind of activities and meeting other people. And that's very interesting to see. That's very constructive way of dealing with a problem in life, right?
Mm-hmm. I always look at grief or even depression with start looking for small victories, because I feel like people can be under trends or follow trends. And so if you're feeling depressed or sad, maybe you make yourself a big healthy meal, or you go for a jog, and that feels good. And you can follow that trend.
Yeah. Because it happens, we end up in a kind of a circle. We think about the same thing again and again, and there's not really reasoning anymore, right?
No.
The reasoning remains the same again and again. So if you break that by a physical activity, for example, or do something completely different than your normal pattern in life, or social activities or sports, you break that cycle, and then you talk with people, right? You talk with people about it, open up. Then other people have maybe different methods to use reasoning to break it up, to don't think about it too much anymore, to start with other things in life, that you move on, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also wanted to ask you, so to anyone that knows nothing about Buddhism, I feel like, especially in the West, a lot of people have a lot of questions and they're not quite sure. What would you say to someone who's curious about Buddhism?
I mean, there's a lot of books available. Sorry. Mm-hmm. So I would just always suggest people to read something, right? And then not just reading it as a novel, but question it, if it's really true. Also, when I give talks, I always ask people, to make sure you check if it's really true what we're talking about. So the self-research is extremely important. We don't accept things that are written or things that are being explained. We have to examine that, if that's true or not. And then only it becomes a kind of real insight, right? Otherwise, it's just kind of a knowledge that just stays a knowledge, but doesn't move forward, right?
Yeah. I love the idea of analyzing things for yourself. I think here in the United States right now, and in other parts of the world, there's a lot of mistrust of scientific institutions, right? A lot of people now say the earth is flat, or that here in the United States, people are saying that COVID is fake, led by our president a bit. Is there a way to take analysis like that too far, right? Like people who think that COVID is fake are putting themselves in harm's way. Is there a limit to analysis like you're describing?
There's no limit, but you have to make sure you open. When we say we have to have a neutral perspective before we examine anything. Yeah, that's very important. So then you look at either something exists or doesn't exist, and what are the reasons? It's a very logical way of approaching things. Like past and future lifetime, same thing. It either exists or doesn't exist, right? Mm-hmm. Or you can change your mind or you cannot change your mind, And then you analyze the reasons for both sides, and then you come to a conclusion. So you have to have this openness. And that's sometimes missing with certain people who already they have already
locked into their mindset,
Yeah, so you have to be open to discussion and open to other people's view, and then analyze, right? If it's true or not. Yeah,
that's true. Is there anything you think I missed related to death or Buddhism?
Yeah, you can, if you want to, you can talk for hours and hours.
Yeah,
about this issue, especially the whole cycle of rebirths, but that's for many people difficult to contemplate. So I think the main thing for us to see is the acceptance, right? Mm-hmm. And when it happens to have this kind of acceptance, and based on knowing that we're gonna all face it, right? So, and it's not kind of a big deal in the sense of it's very scary, because if you look even at statistic findings in scientific research, it's all very positive, dying, right? Yeah, and from a Buddhist point of view, and many other forms of faith and religion, it talks about a lot of aspects of going to beautiful places, right? So it's not every religion or faith have the same kind of descriptions, but to understand things about it is better than not liking to understand things about it, because the uncertainty, right? The uncertainty causes a lot of suffering, right? The uncertainty of where do I go, that's for some people causes fear. Yeah. There's no need for it. There's no need, that people who are dying, they have all kind of pleasure. What we see in the scientific findings, very pleasurable experiences, right? Mm-hmm. And then in Buddhism is kind of, if you go to bed at night you fall asleep, you wake up in the morning, right? That in between period is you unconsciousness, or you have dreams, sometimes you're aware or not. So the dying process is very similar. You die and then you be reborn again. So it's kind of just a change of guest house, so to say. So it's not a big deal from the Buddhist point of view as well. Yeah.
That's so wonderful. And I think you're right. Like, not being open to thinking about the question feels a lot more daunting and heavy. Like, don't put that heaviness on yourself. Just even discussing it, and or hopefully listening to this podcast can make things a bit easier to.
But luckily, there's a good development here in Europe. We have a kind of thing called the Dead Cafe, that people, elderly, they meet on occasionally and talk about these things, to break that boundary of not liking to talk about it, or not liking to think about it, right? And you can see that brings so much peace to the mind of people who later in life and have to face this later on, and they can openly discuss it with each other. That by itself brings a lot of peace. Yeah,
it does. Especially, and a theme of our conversation has been how connected we all are, and how much we need connection and discussion. And that sounds like a beautiful way of handling what can be a challenging issue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We all, what I said, we all on the same planet, wanting happiness, not wanting suffering. We all human beings having the same form of consciousness, same form of emotions. So why not work together and finding methods to improve our life, our inner life, so to say, because that's very important in modern times. We can see we have a lot of incredible external conditions, right? Hospitals, schools, traveling, everything is, generally speaking, to be honest, is quite easy. Now with the COVID, we realize that we're just losing that. We took for granted already. Something is just from the last few decades, right? But so that external development is amazing, but then you see there's so much needed for the inner development. There's a lot of, as we see, depression, right? There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. So that's actually no need to have that much suffering. Something can be done about it, right? So so that's very important to address that in society, and to use methods, either scientific or mix, or check, what's most beneficial and what works.
Well, that's wonderful. Namdak, thank you so much for your time, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I wish you well.
Yeah, thank you so much for your interest, and hope everything goes well with your organization and projects. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I think it's so interesting to hear other people's ways of thinking, and it allows you to breathe it in and see if any of that resonates with you. I had a great time talking to Nomdak, and I hope to do more of these spiritual leader episodes for Death Space Filling the Void. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can reach out to me through the show's social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. I'd also like to mention my other podcast, That Gives Me Anxiety, is out wherever you get your podcasts. It's about the things that scare us, and I take a look at a specific topic each episode. We usually end up finding out that things aren't as scary as we once thought. Also, if you're liking the show, please remember to rate and review it. That's super helpful. And just thank you so much for listening. We're in summer 2021. Good things are coming. Thanks again, and have a great week. I'll talk to you next Thursday.